The mysterious killing of a prominent law professor.
Murdered execution style.
Shot and killed inside his home.
His driver's side window is shattered and he's battered and can't answer. He's inside, the car is running, and he's got blood all over his head.
On the morning of July 18th, 2014, loud bangs echoed through the normally quiet, tree-canopied neighborhood of Benton Hills in Tallahassee, Florida. A man by the name of Jim Geiger looked out of his window to see what happened, and this is when he noticed an unfamiliar, light-colored Prius quickly reverse out of the driveway next door. As concern rose, Jim walked over to check on his neighbor to make sure everything was okay. He saw the garage door open with his neighbor's car just idling inside. As Jim walked closer to the garage, he noticed the driver's side window was busted out. Glass crunched under his shoes as he approached just a few feet away. Jim Geiger was shocked as he realized something terrible had happened. His neighbor, 41-year-old Dan Markel, was sitting in his car, slumped over in the driver's seat, covered in blood. Dan, barely alive, gently swayed his head side to side when Jim called out, "Danny, what happened?" But Dan didn't respond. Jim quickly rushed back home and called 911.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
We heard and looked in, the garage door was up, and I thought the gentleman was backing out, and I went back to my house, but he never backed out, and I came back over, and his driver's side window is shattered, and he's battered and can't answer. He's inside. I don't know.
What's going on with him?
I don't know. The driver's side window is all bashed in, and he's got blood all over his head. He's not responding to me. I think you need to hurry.
When police arrived, Dan Markel was in critical condition as 2 gunshot wounds were found to his head, and he was rushed to the emergency room. But unfortunately, Dan would succumb to his injuries and pass away 15 hours later. As police walked around the scene, it was discovered that nothing was taken from Dan's home. There weren't any broken windows and no signs of a struggle. His wallet was found in his vehicle with all of his cash and cards inside. Everything was completely intact, so authorities ruled out robbery and burglary, leaving investigators to believe that this was not a random incident and Dan Markel was the intended target of this brutal attack. So now the question remained, who was responsible and why would they want Dan Markel dead? But before police could figure out who did this, they had to first figure out who Dan Markel was. Dan Markel was born on October 9th, 1972 in Montreal, Canada. The 41-year-old was an intellectual as he attended the University of Jerusalem, Cambridge, and finally graduated from Harvard University in 2001. At the time of his death, Dan Markel was a highly regarded law professor teaching at Florida State University. Some would even say Dan was among the most accomplished criminal law scholars in the country and was published in the New York Times and The Atlantic. He was also a devout Orthodox Jew and took his religious principles very seriously. Dan was intelligent and articulate and proud of all of his accomplishments, but there was one thing that towered above his pride: his commitment and love for his 2 little boys. See, in 2004, Dan Markel fell in love with a woman named Wendy Adelson. The 2 of them connected on a Jewish dating site known as JDate. So Wendy checked off all the boxes for Dan. She was Jewish, she was beautiful with big blue eyes and blonde hair, and she was very intelligent as she herself also learned a law degree from the University of Miami. Wendy seemingly came from a great family. Her father owned a lucrative dental practice called the Adelson Institute. Her brother Charlie Adelson was a successful periodontist, and their mother Donna worked in the office. The Adelsons were a very tight-knit Jewish family from South Florida. According to his friends, Dan was just head over heels for Wendy, often flirting like a couple of high school kids. Things between Dan and Wendy got serious quickly as they intermixed their friends, met each other's parents, and Wendy relocated to Tallahassee when Dan asked her to move in. At this time, both Wendy Adelson and Dan Markel worked as professors at Florida State University. Everybody believed they were just a match made in heaven, the perfect couple. The two wasted no time before they got engaged, and in February 2006, Wendy Adelson and Dan Markel tied the knot. And just a few short years later, in 2009, they welcomed their first son, followed closely by their second in 2010. Now, life seemed great for Wendy and Dan, but despite their promising start, things went downhill, and in 2012, Wendy Adelson filed for divorce. Court proceedings would later confirm how acrimonious their divorce was. In September of 2012, Dan Markel was on a work trip when he got a call from Wendy that she was taking the kids and leaving him. Dan Markel got on the first flight back home to find the house bare. Everything had been cleared out except for their marital bed, with the packet of divorce papers placed on top, awaiting his signature. Now for Wendy, this was a long time coming, but for Dan, a divorce was completely out of left field as he compared the separation to Pearl Harbor. Dan did everything he could to win Wendy back, but to no avail. Wendy had her mind made up, and she would not falter. Now it took some time for Dan to come to terms with the divorce, which was finalized a year later in July of 2013. But the separation wasn't the only issue. The two began battling for custody of their children, and this is when war was waged. Wendy Adelson wanted to take the boys back and move home to South Florida, but Dan Markel refused as his children meant the world to him. He came to terms with losing Wendy, but he would not sit back as his children were taken away too. After a lengthy court battle, a judge issued a 50-50 custody arrangement, which barred Wendy from moving back home to South Florida with her family. Now, as these cases go, the prime suspect is usually the spouse, or in this case, ex-spouse. So it was no surprise that when Dan Markel was shot, investigators zoned in on Wendy Adelson. Wendy was brought in for questioning, and she was seemingly distraught as police told her the news of the shooting. As questioning continued, Wendy was quite forthcoming with the details of the couple's tumultuous divorce. So naturally, officers needed to rule out Wendy Adelson. She was able to provide a solid alibi for the time of the murder, as she told officers that she was at home getting her TV repaired. Oddly, Wendy offered details about her driving near the crime scene, but when the road was blocked with caution tape and a police cruiser, she turned around and thought nothing of it. Officers then began asking Wendy if Dan had any enemies, or perhaps if Dan owed anybody money. Wendy replied that Dan had actually owed her money, but insisted she had nothing to do with his murder. Wendy goes on listing possible theories. Perhaps it was a disgruntled student of Markel's. Dan recently started dating again, so maybe Dan's new girlfriend had something to do with it. Wendy's recent beau, Jeffrey Lacoste, was mentioned, and in an unusual turn of events, Wendy made statements suggesting the murder of her ex-husband could have been arranged by someone on her behalf without her knowledge. Wendy further suggested that someone could have arranged the murder thinking it would help her, and mentioned that her brother Charlie Adelson had made several jokes about hiring a hitman to kill Dan Markel. More specifically, she said that Charlie makes a lot of jokes in bad taste, and he had previously commented that he had looked into hiring a hitman as a divorce present, but it was cheaper to buy her a television instead. However, Wendy indicated that she did not think her brother or her family was capable of committing this crime. Police then brought in Wendy Adelson's on and off again boyfriend, Jeffrey Lacoste. Police were able to verify that Lacoste had been out of the state at the time of the murder. But over several lengthy interviews, Lacoste provided police with some interesting information, giving his theories on the murder. Lacoste told police not to focus on Wendy, but on her parents and her brother Charlie in South Florida, where he echoed Wendy's sentiments, as Lacoste recalled Charlie Adelson making the hitman joke, further expressing the Adelsons' utter contempt with Dan Markel.
The family desperately wants her back in South Florida. Mother, father, and she has a brother. They hate Danny in a way I've never seen. This kind of obsession. Like their hobby is hating Danny. If I could just say, I would be investigating Charlie Adelson. Now, I don't know if he did this. They're If you're looking at somebody, don't miss him.
Although detectives had a growing suspicion, no evidence could put any of the Adelsons at the crime scene, leaving their investigation at a standstill. As time went on, investigators widened their net of potential suspects as they questioned students, friends, and family about the death of Dan Markel. But just as quickly as they were brought in, their names were cleared with solid alibis and no further leads. And as leads ran cold, the murder of Dan Markel would go unsolved for nearly 2 years. At this point, the police didn't have much to go on, other than the light-colored Prius the neighbor, John Geiger, reported seeing at the time of the shooting. Detectives continued to work tirelessly, trying to figure out who this Prius belonged to. Extensive investigative work was underway as police pulled surveillance footage from traffic lights, local businesses, and city buses, tracing Dan Markel's route on the day of his murder. Earlier in the morning, Markel dropped the boys off at preschool. He ran some errands, and then around 10 a.m., Dan went to have a quick workout before he finally went back home when he was ambushed. Footage obtained from Premier Health and Fitness showed Dan Markel pull into the parking lot, and shortly thereafter, a light-colored Prius was observed pulling in. About 45 minutes later, as Dan Markel left the gym, the same Prius trailed closely behind. Again, the Prius was captured on city bus cameras driving near Dan Markel's residence. This car was the key investigators needed to solve this murder. Upon closer inspection, the Prius had a few unusual characteristics: a missing bolt cover on the driver's side bumper, a mismatched black passenger side mirror, and a toll transponder located on the windshield. As toll roads are not common around the city, investigators believe that perhaps the killer was not from Tallahassee. Toll records then led investigators to a car rental agency in Miami, Florida. And finally, the police got a break in the case. The rental agreement provided the name and contact information of 2 men, Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia of North Miami. Cell tower dumps were conducted to gather cell phone data, which confirmed that both men's cell phones were in the vicinity of the Premier Gym as well as Dan Markel's home on the day of the shooting. As officers began looking into Rivera and Garcia, both men were not strangers to law enforcement. The two had lengthy criminal records, and Luis Rivera was found to be the head of the prominent gang, the Latin Kings. As they reached this major break in the case, investigators were still puzzled by this conclusion. For what reason would these 2 men, or the Latin Kings, want to kill Dan Markel? He was a well-loved law professor who lived 500 miles away. There was no indication that they knew Dan Markel. They didn't rob him or break into his house. This was a planned attack, and at this point, all signs pointed to a murder for hire. And now the question remained, who hired them? Soon detectives would come to find out that their investigation into the death of Dan Markel had just begun. In May of 2016, Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia were charged with the first-degree murder of Dan Markel. Now, at this time, Rivera was already in prison, serving a 12-year sentence for unrelated charges. With the strenuous circumstances of Dan Markel's case, the amount of time that had passed, no DNA left at the scene, investigators still didn't have much evidence to go off of if they wanted to uncover who hired the hitmen to kill Dan Markel. So prosecutors approached Luis Rivera with a plea deal. With his full cooperation, Luis Rivera would have to plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder, and he would receive a reduced sentence of 19 years to be served concurrently with the 12 years he was already serving, essentially just adding an additional 7 years to his current sentence. Luis Rivera took the deal and began singing like a canary, telling investigators everything they needed to know. During his interview, Luis Rivera told investigators about a woman named Catherine McBenua, also known as Katie. Katie was the longtime girlfriend or common-law wife of Sigfredo Garcia, and incidentally, Katie was also discovered to be the former girlfriend of none other than Charlie Adelson. Charlie and Katie became romantically involved in 2013 and were still together at the time of the murder. With this information, detectives began surveilling Charlie and Katie, wiretapping their phones, and monitoring their financial records. Because 2 years had passed since Dan Markel's murder, an operation dubbed The Bump was implemented to get the suspects talking about the murder. So on April 19th, 2016, an undercover FBI agent posing as a Latin Kings gang member approached Donna Adelson, giving her an article about Dan Markel's murder with $5,000 written on it, along with a phone number. The undercover agent pretended to be the brother of Luis Rivera, requesting money on his behalf.
Excuse me, Mrs. Adelson? How you doing? Just want to give you this. Listen. You're scared. No, don't be scared. Listen, just want to let you know that we know that your family has been taking care of Katie and her friend Hugo for quite some time after your problem up north has been resolved. And I want to let you know that my brother, he's incarcerated. He helped your family with this problem you guys had up north. And we want to make sure that he's going through some rough times. And we want to make sure that you take care of what he's going through, the way you're taking care of Katie and Tuco. Well, this will explain it. Thank you.
And the operation worked exactly as the detectives had hoped, leading to a slew of telephone calls, secret lunch meetings, and strange behavior. Like clockwork, right after the bump, Donna Adelson called her son, Charlie, to explain what had just happened, suggesting that this extortion attempt involved the two of them, even though the undercover agent never mentioned Charlie's name.
So, if you had time tonight after work or some other time in the very near future, I need to speak with you.
Okay.
Okay?
Did someone write a letter to you or something?
I got some paperwork hand-delivered to me.
You're being sued?
No, that's what I thought it was, but I'm going to need to talk to you.
Okay.
Okay?
Does it involve me or other people?
Well, probably both of us.
What's that?
Probably the two of us. So you probably have a general idea what I'm talking about.
All right.
So let's just find some time to talk to each other. Take the boys for a ride, okay?
So it's ordered that you talk to me today?
Today or tomorrow. I mean, it's important.
All right. Can I ask you a question? Who is the paperwork sent from?
I see Ben. That's great. It was something that came hand to hand to me as I exited the building today.
Was it anonymous or?
Well, oh no, it's not anonymous. It's not anonymous. I just don't want to discuss it over the phone.
Now, as this call was being monitored, a few things alerted the investigators. The undercover agent never mentioned Charlie's name, yet he was the first person Donna called and indicated that he was involved with this supposed extortion. Donna told Charlie that she was hand-delivered some paperwork and that she needed to talk to Charlie in person, telling him to bring cash. And when he asked how much, Donna responded saying, "This TV is about 5, leading investigators to believe that TV had been code all along. Furthermore, it seemed odd to investigators that Donna never mentioned Dan Markel's name despite the article of his murder being included. In another call, Donna mentions to Charlie that an ex-girlfriend was mentioned by the extortionist, yet she never specified which girlfriend. While Charlie has a history of dating several women, he promptly determined to call his ex-girlfriend Katie McBenua. During these calls, Charlie agreed to go to Donna so they can speak in person, further telling her not to speak about this incident in the apartment. Shortly thereafter, Charlie and Katie met up at a restaurant called Dolce Vita, where their conversation was being monitored and recorded by an undercover agent. But unfortunately for the investigation, loud background noise inside of the restaurant caused most of this conversation to be inaudible. Within the weeks following the bump, a number of conversations were intercepted by investigators. A pattern of calls were recognized like a game of telephone, starting from Donna to Charlie, Charlie to Katie, and Katie to Sigfredo, and back again. The conversations captured them trying to figure out if this man who approached Donna was really associated with Luis Rivera and this extortion was legitimate, or if it was an undercover agent attempting to find information. All four suspects began speaking in code as their demeanor was clearly panicked. In October 1st, 2016, Magbanua became the third person arrested for the murder of Dan Markel, but she wouldn't be the last. Despite having broken up, financial records revealed Katie Magbanua receiving large amounts of money and lavish gifts such as vacations, cars, and breast implants, all paid for by her ex-boyfriend, Charlie Adelson. Katie was also receiving paychecks from the Adelson Institute while having no record of her employment, and the checks were written and signed by Donna Adelson. In 2019, Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine Magbanua were tried together as they both pleaded not guilty on all counts. Sigfredo Garcia, with the testimony of his former friend Luis Rivera, was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Catherine Magbanua's trial, however, ended in a mistrial as the jury could not come to a unanimous verdict. But in 2022, a few months before her retrial, a forensics expert digitally enhanced the audio from the Dolce Vita meeting between Charlie Adelson and Catherine Magbanua, the audio that before was mostly inaudible. After the expert analyzed the recording, vital information was gathered, providing prosecutors with additional evidence. The former couple, Charlie and Katie, discussed undercover agents approaching Donna. Charlie Adelson made a number of comments about the police having no evidence against them, and if he believed they did have evidence, they would already be at the airport, prepared to flee the country. Charlie goes on to introduce a hypothetical situation involving a criminal using a rental vehicle, facts from the case that had not yet been released to the public. 8 years after the murder of Dan Markel, in April of 2022, Charlie Adelson became the fourth arrest, and he was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. The enhancement of the Dolce Vita recording not only led to the arrest of Charlie Adelson, but it is also believed to be the missing piece of evidence from the first trial of Catherine Magbanua. A month after Charlie Adelson's arrest, a jury found Catherine Magbanua guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With 3 people already convicted for the murder of Dan Markel, Charlie Adelson faced his trial in the fall of 2023. With much of the same evidence provided in the trials of the alleged co-conspirators, new evidence emerged against Charlie. Wendy Adelson was called to the stand and granted immunity for her testimony. Although she still defended her brother's innocence, Wendy acknowledged that she herself provided his name as a possible suspect during her initial police interview. Prosecutor Georgia Kappelman went on to question that during her interview, Wendy mentioned that her brother Charlie often made jokes about hiring a hitman as a divorce present, but bought her a TV instead, highlighting the unlikely coincidence that on the morning of the murder, Wendy just so happened to be getting her TV fixed when she called Charlie, and the two decided it would be better to buy a new one. Wendy was further questioned about her contentious divorce with Dan Markel, and while Wendy was clearly disappointed when she couldn't move back to South Florida, one person was discovered to be even more upset than Wendy, the matriarch of the family, Donna Adelson. So much so that authorities have said that the Adelsons were prepared to bribe Dan Markel with $1 million offer if he allowed his ex-wife and their sons to move. But after the long litigation process, Wendy was ready to throw in the towel as she was prepared to buy a home in Tallahassee. Donna, on the other hand, was far from ready to give up. She was ready to fight and more than willing to get dirty. Hundreds of text messages and emails presented to the jury showed Donna Adelson's true disdain for her former son-in-law, as she called him a number of derogatory names and vowed to hit Dan Markel where it hurt. As Dan was a devout Jew, Donna pressured Wendy to threaten Dan with converting the children to Christianity, even suggesting to dress up the boys in Hitler Youth uniforms. Donna expressed frustration with Wendy as she didn't do what she needed to be done to beat Dan. And as the evidence suggested, Donna Adelson would often go to her son, Charlie, to help solve her problems, highlighting the theory that this was the motive for Charlie to hire a hitman. In a surprising turn of events, Charlie's former girlfriend and co-conspirator, Catherine McBanua, testified against him, admitting on the stand that the murder plot was Charlie's idea and she was merely the conduit. According to her testimony, McBanua claimed that Charlie had approached her on Halloween in 2013 when he asked her if she knew someone who can harm someone, to which she confirmed she did. Text messages between Charlie Adelson and his mother, Donna, on that same day revealed that Charlie successfully talked his sister Wendy out of purchasing the home in Tallahassee. Donna responded with delight as she gloated with pride. But if a court barred Wendy from moving out of Tallahassee, why were they so excited? Did they know something was going to happen to Dan, or was this another coincidence? The defense team for Charlie Adelson argued that he did in fact know who killed Dan Markel, but suggested he never told anybody because he himself was being extorted by the killers Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. And Catherine McBanua was the one who misled him into believing that she was actually protecting him. But in fact, according to his defense, Catherine McBanua was the one who orchestrated the entire plot, extorting Charlie Adelson for over $100,000. When Charlie took the stand, he explained that he never told anybody except for his mother, Donna, as he feared for his life. Though the prosecution poked holes in this defense, questioning what the extortionists would have to gain by killing Dan Markel when they could have just simply extorted Charlie.
Why couldn't they just come put a gun to your head and say, give me all the money in your safe?
Thank God they did.
Thank God they didn't?
Thank God they did. I would have gotten killed.
If Garcia hated you, why would he drive to Tallahassee twice to kill someone you hated?
It sounds like he was part of the extortion, or Katie put him up to it.
I still don't get how killing Dan Markel advances the ball for them to extort money out of you.
The jury didn't buy Charlie's defense, and with the evidence stacked against him, Charlie Adelson was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In another turn of events, a week after his conviction, Donna Adelson and her husband Harvey were captured at the Miami airport with one-way tickets to Vietnam. Ironic considering Charlie Adelson's comments about going to the airport if there was evidence against them. Recorded jail calls with Charlie were heard as Donna specifically mentioned looking for countries without extradition, further explaining that she was getting everything together to make sure the boys would be taken care of. In other jail calls, Donna was heard making possible arrangements to commit suicide. These actions were seen as a possible consciousness of guilt. 74-year-old Donna Adelson was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and the solicitation of murder of Dan Markel. Her trial is set to begin in September. Much debate surrounds this case, arguing who was truly involved with the murder plot of Dan Markel. Was Wendy Adelson aware? It seems unlikely that she was able to predict every exact detail of a hitman being hired on her behalf, not to mention that she drove near the crime scene but didn't react like a typical mother might, knowing Dan Markel had the boys that morning. Could it all be a mere coincidence, or will charges be brought against Wendy as well? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.